The leaders of the APEC grouping meeting next week in San Francisco. They'll do so as two major conflicts rage and different parts of the world grapple with the post-pandemic economic recovery with varying success.
APEC is just one of many multilateral organizations formed in the hope that common purpose can be forged amid crisis. But working together, as history shows, even when crisis demands, is remarkably difficult. CNA's Loke tells us more.
Diplomacy, the management of relationships between groups or countries. The earliest formal evidence of that dating back to 1269 BC. From the oldest known peace treaty in the world to the Greek city-state system, to 2 millennia of a Sino-centric world in which countries lined up to pay tribute to an almighty emperor. And centuries later, an evolution from one-to-one ties to larger groupings. The League of Nations in 1920, replaced by the United Nations, repeating in the year of its founding in 1945 a basic promise its earlier iteration had failed to keep.
These differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war.
But now myriad groupings with myriad functions, a blizzard of acronyms almost from A to Z, APEC, ASEAN, AUKUS, ECOWAS and the EU, the OAS, the OIC, the OECD, OPEC and the Quad, RCEP, CPTPP and the WTO. Sometimes it's trade, sometimes security, but in all groupings, different levels of commitment and different duties of care.
And there's no talking groupings without referring to that gold standard for treaty-bound collective defense, NATO, with collective defense very much on the minds of even those in the Indo-Pacific.
NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was established in 1949 to do a couple of things, but primarily keep peace in Europe and, by extension, keep the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe. Finland and Sweden were always in the margins because they are European Union members. Actually, informal arrangements, you can easily join and you can easily leave them. An alliance is a much more binding, permanent thing. The surest way to ensure that Russia would not decide to take its war to Finland was to make it a part of the NATO alliance and therefore be part of the US's security umbrella.
The Ukraine conflict has certainly caught the attention of policymakers in the Indo-Pacific region. Something like this could happen in our own region, whether it's a Taiwan contingency or conflict sparked in the East or South China Sea. And I think that probably has energized the response of concerned parties and encouraged the momentum of minilateral forms of cooperation. I think what's drawn the most headlines recently has been the massive reinvigoration of so-called minilateral or small group configurations of security cooperation, such as the Quad and AUKUS. These are certainly not military alliances in terms of they don't have a binding mutual security treaty at their heart, but a more informal, more flexible, more wide-ranging institutions with a much less developed institutional infrastructure behind them. But then if we look below the formal institutional infrastructure of something like the Quad, then we actually see a whole range of sort of connective tissue between the members within the Quad. For example, on a bilateral level or sub-Quad level, each of the countries within the Quad cooperates and carries out a huge number of activities and has a huge number of bilateral arrangements or even trilateral in the case of the US, Australia and Japan, that serve to undergird the Quad and give it perhaps more substance than originally meets the eye.
The Quad, I think, is the flavor of the year, if not the decade. And one of the best ideas of the Quad is not just the fact of this glue that holds them together, but the fact that they are effectively coalitions of the willing. I'm using a phrase that was used by George W. Bush when he was president of the United States. Coalitions of the willing they're on the same page, and they can progress quite quickly to deal with issues. Big multilaterals like the United Nations are great because they have massive convening power. They get almost all 200 countries into the mix. Problem is, if you want to do something tangible, that's not possible. So if you really want to get things going, you really need to have smaller kind of nuclei, if you like, countries who can work, who are like-minded on the major issues and can go faster on issues that matter.
The recent UN General Assembly meeting was underwhelming for many observers because of its watered-down statements on Ukraine, and it's the fact that Russia and China sit on the UN Security Council. So the ability of that organization to take strong moves and measures is fundamentally crippled. But that's not necessarily the point of the United Nations anymore. No matter how many of these little minilateral alignments and coalitions form, there is still a need to have a forum at that strategic level to be able to talk, to be able to have the back channel communications. Diplomacy isn't just public statements and getting things done and military operations. It's actually quiet, routine, talking to each other as humans. And sometimes that yields official progress, and sometimes just having the relationship is sufficient because you've got somebody to call in a crisis.
Minilateral flavor of the decade, the Quad is a hodgepodge of connections, and that's just those involving its founding members. Looking outside the four, it's a tangled web with multiple connections over multiple layers across multiple issues of security and trade. Economic survival is, after all, still a primary concern, even as weapons and war are what's making the headlines today. Ukraine and Israel igniting global divisions, recharging long-standing alliances, driving bilateral diplomacy, but also highlighting how much we need multilateral cooperation. Perplexing, plodding, prone to pitfalls.
This organization, founded in the wake of the Holocaust, fails to act on its founding principles.
China solemnly calls on the parties to the conflict to cease all hostilities.
We support UN-led efforts.
My hope is that Russia will step up and be a responsible player in the Security Council.
But that's just how the world has evolved to get things going and get things done.